Hi everyone, I'm Geoff Hall, and I'm here with Marilyn Day, one of my partners up at the Westford Historical Society, and we're doing a tribute to Francis Michael Sullivan, a Forge Village boy who was very involved with the GI Bill of Rights. Francis Michael Sullivan passed away in 1954, so it's some 70 years after his passing. In May of 2024, we will be dedicating a monument to Francis Michael Sullivan, someone who has been overlooked in our town's history, but whose efforts in Washington has touched millions of lives. And if it hadn't been for Francis' son, Daniel Sullivan, who visited Westford in 2010, chances are we would have overlooked him as being such a significant individual. Let's start there.
In 2010, when Dan Sullivan and his sister Ann Hilliard came to Westford to visit the town where their father, Francis Michael Sullivan, was born and grew up, Dan visited the town hall where he met Town Clerk Patty Doobie, then Town Clerk Patty Doobie. From there he got to meet Bob Oliphant, Ginny Moore, Penny LaCroix, Mickey Crocker, and a host of other wonderful, helpful Westford people. He specifically mentioned Mickey Crocker, and then following Dan's visit to Westford, he completed the biography of his father. He sent several...
Which you can see on the screen. That is the biography, and a very interesting read, Marilyn.
And fortunately, he shared it with many of the departments in town. So John and Nora Sullivan came to the U.S. In 1895 on Cunard's ship, the Gallia. The passenger list shows them coming from Ireland with their destination as Forge Village. The booklet informs us that a Nellie Sullivan, John's sister, had paid for their fares to come to the United States.
Actually, it was the sister-in-law.
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 Thank you. The passenger list showed that they were in good health, so nobody got detained and sent back to Ireland. And John would have a job coming into Forge
John would have a
Village.
job coming into Forge Village. It's interesting because here's Nellie, who's already here, and she's telling this, what a great place. There's work here. You know, we'll take you in. There's all sorts of opportunities. So it's an immigrant family coming here for the opportunities that America offers.
So Francis, the man we are honoring, was born in Forge Village in December 1897 to John and Nora. He was their second child. An older brother, Daniel, was born in 1895, not too many months after John and Nora had arrived here. They would eventually have 5 children.
5 children, yeah. It was Francis Michael, John William, Mary was born in 1902, James Edward was born in 1905. Daniel actually attended Harvard University, the oldest boy. Mm-hmm. Wow, that's something else, isn't it?
I know it. This immigrant family is just so impressive.
Okay, so where did John work, Marilyn?
He's over at the Abbott Western Company. We have this delightful photo. This is where John worked. The first few views show the mill with only one level in 1903.
Okay, and that's so he moves here, the mill, 1903, and this is the wool sort. Okay, and the next slide I think will show you an improvement to the mill, and it's interesting. This is shown from Bradford Street, and look at that, Marilyn. It has a dirt road. The roads certainly haven't been paved. But most of the people at the time were walking back and forth to the mill. You worked right in the area. What they're not showing you is, and we'll see it a little later, is just the corner of the boarding house that was right across the street from the mill.
Mm-hmm. So in 1900, he was first listed as a laborer. And then in 1920 and 30, he was listed as a wool sorter.
What a picture here, huh? This is what the wool sorters did.
Yeah.
It was tough work. It really was.
They must have been checking lengths of the wool and the fiber. And
yeah, absolutely,
whatever. Yeah. John was also a member of the John Edwards Hose Company, number 3, in Forge Village. This photograph shows the hose company with their silver cup after winning the Fireman's Muster in 1910.
Boy, those Fireman's Musters were big things. I can remember going to the Fireman's Musters 50s, 60s, and 70s, and it's kind of died out. I know Groton still has one, but they used to take great pride in that. Look at that picture of John Sullivan standing there in the background.
Yeah.
And it made sense because the fire station was around the corner from where he lived, right across from almost across from the Cameron School.
Exactly. And fortunately, the names are written on the back, so we have them all identified.
Okay.
The family lived on Pond Street in housing provided by Abbott Mill.
Yeah, and the next slide will show you that. This is Pond Street, and it's taken around 1903. And you say the Sullivan's house is the third one on the left.
Yeah.
Okay, if you can't see it too well, but in back of the Sullivan's house is where Forge Pond was, which John Sullivan ultimately takes advantage of.
Sure, running his 15-cent an hour boats.
And then the next couple of slides show you here's Nora holding Mary, John Sullivan, once again that mustache, huh?
Yeah.
The children, John W., Daniel J., okay, and then Francis M. is there in his little sailor's uniform, it looks like, huh? Isn't that interesting because he ends up enlisting in the Navy?
Yeah. What's interesting is these houses were only 18 feet by 30 feet. Mm-hmm. Small houses, but reasonably rented to the workers.
That's right. These houses were built by Abbott for that purpose. Oh, we'll show you Dan and Francis, okay? And this apparently looked like it was taken in front of the mill. The one after that, it was probably taken the same day. But this shows you Freedom Park in 2023, and that area was known for years by people as Sullivan Shore, even after the family had left the area. And this is kind of the way it looks today. It's also conservation land. But we know that in 2015, it became Freedom Park, one section of it, as part of a Boy Scout, Eagle Scout project. We'll get into that a little later.
As Geoff just said, this is Sullivan Shore, and Mickey Crocker has told stories of renting boats for 15 cents an hour from Mr. Sullivan, saying Mr. Sullivan would turn a blind eye if the kids kept the boat out over the hour limit.
Okay. Well, the kids grew up in Forge Village. Francis's brother, they went to the Cameron School. And you can see this slide, Cameron School in 1908 had been expanded by that time, was an 8-room schoolhouse. And it was grades 1 through 8. In fact, it was grades 1 through 8 up until about the middle of the 1950s when the Abbott School was built. But from there, he went to Westford Academy. And there's Westford Academy, which was the place, Rodenbush, what we now know today as Rodenbush, but it was the academy from 1897 to 1955. You know, this is an interesting picture here, Marilyn, of the Westford Academy class of 1916, minus Estelle, who was a member of that class. But the ones in the back row, and you can see Francis Sullivan on the left-hand side at the end, and the other boys who were members of that class. And then there's some of the other people who worked in the front row were looked like underclassmen and wearing those spiffy knickers. Look at those, huh?
They are just.
Okay, so we get to the next slide, and that shows you the graduation exercises at Westford Academy, which were all held at Town Hall on Wednesday, the 21st of June at 10 o'clock in the morning. The march, the overture, the class history, Song of the Indian Peasants, the class will, which was read by Francis Sullivan, prophecy by Leo James Connell, and then Little Boy Blue. The next slide shows you the graduates. It says at the top, Estelle is absent from the picture, but the academic courses, Frederick Sullivan Haley, John Joseph Provost, the English business courses, Estelle Amy Berlin, Leo James Cornell, Artemis Gage Griffin, and then you see Francis Sullivan. Kind of an interesting class here, Marilyn. Frederick S. Haley, that's with the American Legion.
Oh.
In Graniteville is named after him. He served in World War I and was killed in action in World War II. Leo Cornell, from that class, was postmaster up at the Center Station when it was located
On Lincoln Street.
On Lincoln Street, yes, okay.
He was also one of the caretakers at the town farm.
Caretakers at the town farm, correct. And he lived in the house next to where the cottage, next to the museum.
Number 4 Boston Road.
He was a little older then, but when I lived there, he was like the little elf that delivered tomatoes and cucumbers in the morning and left them on our steps.
And you could see pictures of him in the Sanders presentation that we did, that John Sanders had done.
Absolutely so. And of course, Francis Sullivan is the picture on the far right.
This is the military census from Connecticut in 1917. The questions that they asked were interesting. Francis has relocated to Connecticut at this point.
And we're obviously living in Waterbury.
Yep, age 20, and a clerk.
Yeah. And can you ride a horse? Can you handle a team? Can you drive an automobile? Ride a motorcycle? Understand telegraphy? Operate a wireless? I mean, kind of interesting. Are you a good swimmer? He writes fair. But he was living in Waterbury, Connecticut. It's not till the next year, in June of 18, that he's living in Lowell, where he applied for enlistment in the United States Naval Reserve Force. And I think the next slide shows you Francis Sullivan served in the U.S. Naval Reserve with the rank of C2, Seaman Second Class, as that meant. Francis Sullivan was a graduate of Westford Academy, class of 1916, left for Boston on Tuesday, June 25th, 1918, and where he passed all examinations for the Navy. And this is from the Westford Woodsman, 29th of June, 1918. Look at this, Marilyn, a couple of newspaper clippings. Why don't you read those?
It's interesting that both brothers were serving at the same time. We have Sergeant Daniel Sullivan is spending a 5-day furlough at the home of his parents, Mr. and Mrs. John Sullivan of Forge Village. Oh. Sergeant Sullivan recently arrived at Camp Upton. I won't try to pronounce that, Long Island.
Long Island.
Long Island, from France, where he's been in service for the past 9 months, and he wears the coveted service stripes on his sleeve. Francis Sullivan of the U.S. Navy also spent the week at home.
Yeah, and this is from the Lowell Sun, 27th of August, 1918 on page 7. Yeah. At the next slide, we'll show you we kind of moved ahead because the war ends, and after the war ends, Francis then goes to Connecticut, where he goes to work as a reporter, okay? I think out of the Waterbury office. And he's recognized by Congressman Glynn, who named him as his private secretary. Congressman-elect James P. Glynn of the 5th District has appointed Francis M. Sullivan, 28 years old, political reporter of the Waterbury American, to be his secretary at Washington. There are about 15 candidates for that appointment. So he's chosen, and so now he gets his feel of what's going on in Washington, how legislation is produced, and this is from the Stanford Advocate, 27th of February, 1925.
And there is James P. Glynn. He lived from 1867 to 1930, and Francis got to serve on his staff in Washington. Unfortunately, it was not a very long time of service. as Glenn died in 1930, and he was succeeded by Edward W. Goss.
Okay. And the next slide shows you a major part of Francis's life. He marries Catherine Ann Schreider, beautiful woman. Francis and Catherine Ann Schreider of Tacoma Park, Washington, D.C. were married on the 9th of June, 1928 at St. Mary's Church in Annapolis, Maryland.
They had met on Valentine's Day the previous year.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, the next slide will give you where in 1929, while all this is going on, Francis goes back to school. He receives his degree from the National University Law School. The National University Law School then became part of what's known as George Washington University School of Law. Yes, look at this, Marilyn, from the Evening Star. Okay, it shows 190 out of 385 passed the bar exam. Interesting, 17 winning the right to practice in the District Supreme Court.
Are women.
Are women, okay, at the time. This is 1929. And if you look at the arrow, it shows Francis Sullivan's name down the bottom. Okay, after he passes his exam here, Marilyn, actually, the Congressman Glynn passes away, and he goes to work for his replacement, Congressman Goss. But he spends a lot of time in the 30s actually working before the U.S. Court of Appeals, and ultimately, while working for Congressman Goss. And because of his law degree, he's practicing. Somewhere on the line, the American Legion has got to see his talent. So he goes to work for the American Legion. I'm not sure when in the 1930s, but what happens with him?
Well, in early November 1941, according to the newspaper, Francis Michael Sullivan was appointed acting National Legislative Director of the American
I think the
Legion.
next slide shows you that. Yeah. Yep, Legion picked Sullivan for the legislative post. Acting National Legislative Director of the American Legion by the National Commander, Lynn U. Stombaugh, according to an Associated Press dispatch from. So he's now the key legislative post, and actually writing legislation and determining what legislation that the Legion will be presenting to the Congress.
Right.
And boy, this is November of 41. What happens?
Oh, all too soon. Well, Abbott Mill has now started to sell off some of the houses that they built for their employees. Francis and his wife came to Westford, and they bought the house on Pond Street at number identified as Lot 27.
Yeah. Okay.
And they bought it for his parents so that they could remain in the home.
Yeah, Abbott's now selling off a lot of the, where the renters had been for a long time. Mm-hmm. I know that my house in Forge Village is like in the mid-40s or something like that, during World War II. But it says he and his wife had purchased a house at Lot 27 on Pond Street. What else is happening in December of 1941, Marilyn?
Just a month later, after this, war breaks out.
War breaks out, yeah? And so
Francis filled out his World War II draft registration form.
And I think we got that draft registration here. He realizes, he's got to sign up. Age 44 at the time, okay? But he was required to fill out draft registration, and although they weren't taking them at that age very often, he was required to, okay?
Advancing now to 1943.
Boy, this is a tough year for Francis Sullivan. He's inundated with work with the American Legion, and in January, he receives word that his dad, John F. Sullivan, was burned in a fire. John, after he retired, was bedridden. Yeah, bedridden. And he was trapped in the kitchen of his home where he was sleeping. He was 75 years old. His wife rushed to the home of a neighbor in order to sound when the alarm was sounded, and returned to the house, but was not able to get inside to rescue him. So John Sullivan passed away in that fire. John, interestingly enough, Francis at the time, with all the stress that was going on in his life, suffered a heart attack and was bedridden for some time. And that's how you treated people who had heart attacks. I can remember my uncle and my grandfather were treated much the same way.
1943, back in Forge Village, Francis decides that it's time to sell the property.
Sells it back to Abbott Westford.
Sells it back to Abbott Westford.
Yeah.
And the arrow shows the spot where the house had been, and that's now the parking lot.
And church, 1990, by 1989, now owned by Murray Printing, the land included the land where the Sullivan house stood on Lot 27, was sold to the town of Westford. And, you know, I mean, I can go back, Marilyn, and tell you, you know, my history of this. It was Murray Printing took it over, or Murray's, and it had several different owners, probably for tax purposes. But we swam down there. I remember in the 50s and the 60s, Phil Murray operated his boat out of that area. In the 1970s, his aquaplane, okay? And then once again, it was, you know, kind of by the 80s and into the 90s, and then it was just, you know, kind of open and a place where people would fish and things like that. Okay. So the town of Westford actually takes the parcel, and it remains that. But we're kind of getting off track here. Let's get back to Francis Sullivan during World War II. In the next slide, okay, this shows Francis Sullivan with the Senate Committee of the Veterans Affairs and several other executives of the American Legion in March of 1944. The GI Bill of Rights passed both chambers of Congress, and after minor adjustments, it was sent to the White House for signature. President Roosevelt signed the bill into law in the summer of that year. But let's just pause with this picture here. In the booklet, there's a chapter that Francis's son writes called "Success Has Many Fathers." And when you look at the GI Bill of Rights, you look at any number of current sources, print or online, regarding the authorship of the GI Bill of Rights, several names reoccur. Henry Colmery of Kansas, William Atherton of California, John Steele of Illinois, Congresswoman Edith North Rogers from Lowell, who was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee where this bill went through, and U.S. Senator Ernest McFarland, just to name a few. So how does Francis Sullivan come into the picture? Well,
see that on the next slide.
As it says, and we give these names of people who deserve the credit, but it is the task of one writer who must organize and consolidate all of these ideas. A historical account closest to the actual signing of the bill into law explains that John Steele of Illinois proposed that the American Legion draft a single inclusive statute to govern the major assistance which the federal government should use to help establish the discharged servicemen in civil life. Steele proposed the legislation, and Colmery and others identified and outlined needs in detail. But it was Francis Sullivan who actually drafted the complex, overreaching bill. The plan, a single statute, was approved by the Legion Executive Committee in November of 1943. Within a few weeks, Francis Sullivan, the acting legislative director, had drafted a bill. Bennett Clark introduced the bill in the Senate, and as you see in the picture before that, the Senate committee, and shows Bennett Sullivan and the others in that picture there. Okay? And you can see Francis's picture. Okay, in June 22nd, 1944, President Roosevelt signs into law the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, known as the GI Bill of Rights. Francis Sullivan and others who made the legislation a reality, of course, are pictured in that picture. Representative Edith North Rogers with that hat, standing over the shoulder in a very famous picture as one of the key sponsors on the House side, is she's in the foreground. But standing right in back of her is Francis M. Sullivan from Forge Village.
And Francis was a very retiring person. He always was giving credit to everyone around him.
That's why I guess you don't hear his name, and his son said that, you know. Why don't you hear more about Francis Sullivan? It was his personality. Never talked over or through anyone. He did his job for the people he admired, the returning veterans, without pounding his fist in insistence that he had done the writing of the form. So others received much of the credit.
Right.
So, never self-promoting himself. At the close of World War I, returning veterans were given $60 and a train ticket home. Those who were injured received nothing. They were also promised money to be given in 1945, and through history, 1932, when the Great Recession, in the middle of it, they needed the money, and they formed the bonus army that stormed Washington, D.C. And with all of this in mind, the powers to be in Washington, D.C. recognized that we've got to do something differently this time. So the Readjustment Act, or the GI Bill of Rights, provided three major things. Educational benefits. Well, for the first time in history, it wasn't just those who were wealthy or come from prominent families that were able to get educational benefits and go on to college, even though the Sullivans kind of showed you it wasn't always that case, because his older brother went to Harvard and he ended up going to Boston University. But for the most part, you know, if you were in high school, you went on if your family didn't have money. This offered the opportunity for more of them. Helped create the middle class, Maryland. Also, the opportunity for home ownership. And many took advantage of that. You saw many of the houses, the suburbs being built after the Second World War, and a lot of these people moving into the suburbs were able to do so through the benefit of the GI Bill of Rights. And probably one of the most important, and this is where Francis Sullivan comes into the picture again, because he becomes the director of the Disabled American Veterans Organization. And you see it in the next slide? Just gives you an idea. The GI Bill of Rights began more than 21.3 million veterans, service members, and family members have received $72.8 billion in GI benefits for education and training. The number of GI Bill recipients includes 7.8 million veterans from World War II. 2.4 million from the Korean War. Okay? Since the dependence upon the program was enacted in 1956, VA also has assisted the education of more than 700,000 dependents of veterans whose deaths or total disabilities were service-connected. The VA began helping veterans purchase homes under the original GI Bill. Through May of 2006, VA issued more than 18 million VA home loan guarantees and a total of $892 billion. In fiscal 2005 alone, the VA guaranteed 165,854 loans valued at $25 billion. At the beginning of the fiscal year 2006, had 2.3 million active home loans, reflecting authorized loans totaling $202.1 billion. This particular article from the Lowell Sun states that in April, the announcement was made today of the appointment of Attorney Francis Sullivan, formerly of Forge Village, as the National Director of the legislation for disabled American veterans, which is a position he held. And I think you see in the next slide, undated photos showing Harry Truman signing an extension of the veterans legislation with Francis Sullivan on the right-hand side. The slide after that shows Dwight D. Eisenhower meets with the executives of the disabled American veterans. Francis, you can see now, is using a wheelchair, okay? But his work continues right up until the time of his death. And that occurs in the 24th of January, 1954. He is interred at Arlington National Cemetery. On the right-hand side, you can see the placard to his gravesite. National Legislative Director of the Disabled American Veterans, died at the Doctors Hospital from a heart condition, and we knew that he had a heart attack in 1943. But he worked right up into the end to provide for the veterans who had served our country.
He received many accolades. Newspaper after newspaper published his obituary.
Okay, next slide.
Please.
Once again, the toast. They'll blow taps at Wednesday at Arlington National Cemetery for Francis Sullivan. And this is from the Washington Post. But the next slide I find interesting. This comes from the Congressional Record. And I want to read you just a portion of this. This is a tribute from Representative Edith North Rogers. Mrs. Rogers of Massachusetts asked and was given permission to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend her remarks. Mrs. Rogers of Massachusetts, Mr. Speaker, this morning I attend the funeral of Francis M. Sullivan, the National Director of Legislation for Disabled American Veterans. Most of you, I am sure, knew Frank Sullivan for his long years of unselfish service in behalf of the disabled veterans of all of our wars. The Committee on Veterans Affairs, of which I am the chairman, has for years sought his advice and counsel upon legislative matters. So, you know, those congressmen went to people like Francis Sullivan, and he gave so much back. Next slide. Well, we asked a few people how the GI Bill affected their lives. Wayne Moore, okay? Wayne Moore stated, currently, I have a VA benefit due to the Agent Orange causing diabetes, among other more deadly diseases. This gives me access to doctors, hospitals, etc. Wayne used the GI Bill to go to Lowell Tech. In 1971, she and Wayne took advantage of the GI Bill to buy their first house in Southborough, Mass. The next slide is one of my best friends, Jim Van Beaver, and a picture of him in Vietnam. He served there in the 101st Airborne Division from 1969 to 1970. He says, I probably could have afforded and gotten into a community college without the benefit of the GI Bill, but the bill gave me the incentive to return to school and complete my education. The GI Bill gave me the free tuition to a state college and a monthly stipend to live on while in school. Aside from these benefits, the bill allowed me to attend school full-time without the necessity of working too many hours. This was an additional benefit for someone who had been out of school for several years. I started college at Mount Wachusett Community College, later transferred to Lowell State College, where I completed my bachelor's degree. The GI Bill allowed me to get jobs that I would never have been qualified for had I never gone back to school. It was a life changer. It was worth my service, the years of service in the military. Okay, Marilyn.
Okay.
The memorial marker, okay, for Francis Michael Sullivan will be placed in front of the flagpole here at Freedom Park. It'll be done on Sunday, May 26th, 8:45 in the morning. And as I said, we probably would not have known about it had not been for the family coming up here and reading the book and saying, when we were doing the Forge Village walkthrough, saying, hey, it's time that this gentleman was recognized. You know, I just want to say, if there was ever an all-American story about an immigrant family coming to the United States because of the opportunities this country availed it, have an appreciation for what the country stands for, and have an appreciation for those who fought and died for it.
Yeah.
Francis Michael Sullivan. I want to thank you. Go ahead, Dan. You can take it from there, Marilyn.
Thank you to Dan and to his sister Anne for their dedication and love of their father, and for sharing that with us.
And a few more credits down there. With our thanks to the following people: Jim Ciro, Massachusetts State Representative.
I don't
Okay,
think you need to
I want to pick him out, and I want to pick out Marisha Kaziniak Taylor. That's Marisha Kaziniak Taylor, and the Sullivan family for their financial support for this project. Because without their financial support, we would not have been able to procure the monument that's going to be there. Dave Christiana, Marilyn Day for your work, Patty Doobie, Christopher Gorham, who wrote The Confidant. You might want to mention, okay, the work there.
Yes, we had a footnote back on the page where we talked about the great benefits they got after World War I, or the lack of benefits. That was very enlightening.
Yeah, and he actually, who was the woman that was sent out by
Anna Rosenberg.
Anna Rosenberg, and he mentions in the book that, you know, when she got out after the BRGA Bill of Rights was written, she went out and found out that the soldiers exactly what they were looking for. They were looking for housing and an opportunity for education. Of course, Linda Green, myself, Ginny Moore for her input, Wayne Moore, thank you very much, Jim Van Beaver, Westford Monuments and Memorial Committee, who were thoroughly behind it, Westford Museum and Historical Society for their work in helping us along, Veterans Organization, the help of Ryan Cobley and Heather Monahan, and Westford Cat, and particularly Nick Woodbury, who makes us all look good. Thank you, Nick. And thank you all for watching.